How's it going? Welcome back, my wonderful wise ones. Today I have a special video, something that I have been sitting on for a long time at this point. It's been like half a year. I've been wanting to make this video. So today is a special video, I think, because I want to blend some of these ideas together. So check out my Wise Philosophy playlist if you're interested. Now, you've probably heard of Jungian's Shadow before, the concept. You might have heard about some gurus talk about this, like Jordan Peterson, etc. And I personally believe that a lot of these modern day gurus are quite equivalent to modern day YouTube grifters, kind of leaning into one political ideology to get that demographic, not actually believing what they usually spout, but more so to capture a particular audience for revenue. Okay, that's sadly the landscape of YouTube. It's happening a lot on the gaming side of things, with a lot of political grifters targeting a type of audience, and I absolutely find that disgusting. And also, a lot of these modern day philosophers, you have to understand that they're not actual philosophers, they're more academics, okay? That's why on this channel I'm trying to bring back the core essence of what a philosopher is, because philosophy isn't an academic subject, it is a lifestyle, it is something that you live and breathe every single day. Now, the Jungian Shadow is a very interesting concept, and although it leans more into psychology than it does philosophy, it does have a lot of implications in the philosophical realm. And a lot of philosophers like Nietzsche and stuff like that, they kind of latched onto this idea because it was the best idea on how we describe ourselves. Most people would agree that there is a dualist kind of essence within human beings, and my own philosophy that I'm trying to create on this channel, called solism, that is one of the core beliefs, is that we are of a dualist nature, the unconsciousness and the consciousness being part of a greater consciousness, a universal consciousness, if you will, and thoughts kind of appearing to us from the metaphysical ideas and manifesting themselves into reality. So check out my Solism playlist if you're interested, because that is the real world movement that I'm trying to create on this channel if you are interested.
It was horrible.
So back to the idea of the Jungian Shadow, okay? Like I said, a lot of philosophers latched on to his ideas, and he kind of reshaped how we think about modern day psychology and human beings in general. That there is an unconscious, that there is a consciousness, there's the ego, the persona, and your actual self, and the shadow. Okay, so there's different elements that create our being. We're not just a one single thing, even though it's easier to pretend that we are. And perhaps some of you are kind of uncomfortable by looking into the mirror, but I highly recommend that you do so to learn more about yourself. So we are made up of all of these different elements, if you will. And the shadow is basically this idea that it's the darker aspects of our personality, of our self, of our temptations, our ego, all of these different, aspects that we are made from. It's the darker aspects of our personality that we don't usually manifest, that we keep hidden. And some people will confront their shadow, some people will use it to better themselves. That's what Nietzsche believed. He believed in the idea of the Übermensch, which is becoming your ideal self, self-actualization. That's what most philosophy is all about. With Buddhism, it's almost reaching enlightenment. With Stoicism, it's about eudaimonia.
It was horrible.
Of course it was horrible. Violence is a very horrible thing.
Was such a revolutionary thinker, and he changed how we perceived ourselves. And he's coined phrases that we all use today, like, I'm an introvert, you're an extrovert, stuff like this. So he is a very big figure, and he is one of the main, influences behind people like Jordan Peterson, how they rose to fame and power. It's because of them kind of, carrying on his work in essence to a degree. So he's a very influential figure. But today I just want to tackle that one thing, the shadow, okay? Because I think that's so interesting, especially when it comes to video games, because no one really talks about this, but video games can be pretty messed up. They can be pretty dark, okay? And some of my personal favorite video games are, in fact, the morally dark RPGs that I love, okay? You know, Fallout, for example. Vampire, one of my all-time favorite games that I haven't discussed. I'm gonna make a separate video on this at some point. You know, did I say Fallout New Vegas already? I think I did. But there's, you know, a lot of games out there that give us flexibility and moral choices, but it's not just RPGs. The idea of the shadow can be found in all media, but especially it's prevalent in video games because it makes for such an interesting concept, you know, a villain that has manifested this actual shadow identity fully and kind of lost themselves. You know, we can see this very well in one of my all-time favorite games, Dark Souls, with Artorias. He kind of lost all of these other aspects of himself. His ego, or you could say that his ego kind of blinded him into following his shadow, but you know, his actual, you know, self, his unconsciousness, he kind of lost who he was and he became this one singular identity, which is the shadow, and that's why he's totally mad and, you know, just wants to kill you basically and wants to kill everyone. Now, the interesting thing about Jungian Shadow is basically, you know, these are our desires, okay, our, you know, kind of unwanted thoughts and wishes. And in my own personal philosophy, solism, I would say that these shadow thoughts, okay, they still all come from the metaphysical realm, as it were. You know, they are all actual thoughts, simply thoughts, you know, impressions, and they don't actually have any weight, any meaning to them, any value or action, unless if you actually manifest them into reality. We can all think certain things, we've all had dark thoughts now and then, I'm sure, but unless if you manifest them into the actual objective reality, it does not actually have any, you know, meaning, as it were, in this world that we live. And Nietzsche kind of picked up on some of the ideas I've been thinking about, and basically he said that a lot of it was just cowardness, the reason that we don't tap into our shadow, and the reason why modern morality and this idea of, you know, a universal morality, a human morality, is false, and it kind of holds us back. And that's, you know, his whole idea of becoming the Übermensch, becoming the best possible version of yourself that you can be, having morality hold you back, is basically just cowardness, not, you know, that you actually are moral, but basically you're too scared to act on these darker desires because of the repercussions of society and the society system that we built up.
If one is to understand the great mystery, one must study all its aspects.
And that's very true, because being harmless isn't the same thing as being morally virtuous, okay? And a lot of people in society today, they might think, you know, dark thoughts, they might even want to act on them, but they simply don't, because we live in a society today that limits criminal behavior and these, you know, darker thoughts that some people want to act on. But actually, they don't have any morality in them whatsoever. And that's quite a scary thought, but you have to wrestle with that and question, what would you do yourself if no one was watching? You know, it's kind of a thought experiment of like having an invisibility cape, or, you know, like the Lord of the Rings ring or something like that. Like, would you actually use that for good, or would you use it for some dark desires that you might have? And that is the problem with the human condition, is, you know, the idea of seeking power and all of this stuff, you know, the darker thoughts that we all have, like resentment, self-doubt, and our desires. That's why, you know, philosophies like Buddhism, for example, they try and destroy desire completely, because they see that as the root of human suffering. But the thing about the shadow that you have to understand, it's not purely evil, it's more neutral, okay? And just like with Stoicism, most things as a Stoic are indifferent to you, unless if it's in line with your moral being, something that I also take heavy inspiration in my own philosophy, what is natural and what is not natural. But basically, you have to understand that there is potential for goodness in the shadow as well, because it might be, for example, be, you know, self-improvement. It might, for example, be, you know, holding you back if you don't tap into your shadow because you're too scared of the consequences. Perhaps taking a risk might actually benefit your life or other people's lives. So there are useful, ways to integrate your shadow to, to understand that you are capable of violence, but you don't necessarily have to use violence. There are many different ways to interpret the shadow, and it gets very complicated. Now, some philosophers like Ayn Rand, for example, who was a heavy inspiration for the game BioShock, and maybe I'll talk about that at some point in the future, but basically she believed that, this society that we've created, that the idea that we never integrate our shadow, that we're afraid of our shadow, limits human potential and society's potential for greater scientific discoveries. Human innovation gets stagnated because of our limited view on morality and how we integrate the shadow with ourselves and with society and stuff like that. And yet, like I said, that's a heavy inspiration for the game BioShock, because that city in BioShock is built around this idea of being free from the rest of society's morality and not letting it interfere with pursuing the boundaries of what's possible with science and technology and art and morality and all this stuff, not having a traditional government in that sense. And this is what I want to talk about. This is the main topic of today's video. I just had to give you some context. If you enjoy this type of content, this is truly what I'm passionate about. I love, talking just about the games themselves, but I like to analyze them a lot deeper. So let me know if you like this type of content and you want to see more of this bridge between my philosophical stuff and gaming. That would be very helpful. And if you're new here, like the video. It would be very useful to get this video out to more people, and that you subscribe, become a wise one today, because this channel is not simply a channel, it's more a movement, and if you subscribe, it would mean a great deal to me. If you ignore the shadow completely, it might actually simply take over your life. The desires and everything will overcome you, and that is what Aristotle talked about, is how we integrate them with virtue, and that's personally what I believe as well, and most good philosophers or philosophy would encourage that as well, not just to be completely overrun by your shadow, but integrating it correctly. So what I love so much about video games, is it gives you complete freedom for the most part. Obviously, it's depending on if it's a linear game, if it's a narrative based click point adventure, or if it's a sprawling RPG like Baldur's Gate or something like Dark Souls, more action driven. But for the most part, it's interactive. It's not like reading a book, it's not like watching a TV show or watching a movie. You are taking part in this media. You are deciding what happens. You are inputting the actions and then seeing those actions come into being, just like manifesting your own thoughts into reality. That's what video games do so well. They are such a great outlet for expression. So the reason I want to talk about the Jungian Shadow in video games and the shadow in video games is because so many games do this so well. RPGs, like I said, like Fallout New Vegas, often give you morality decisions, deep conversations with characters with different ideologies and philosophies, and you deciding what is morally correct or not. And the thing is, in video games, a lot of games deal with dark aspects because we are naturally drawn as human beings to darker aspects of life. In ancient Rome, we would watch gladiators fight to the death. We believe we've become more sophisticated, more refined over time, that our base desires have become less bloodthirsty and animalistic. But no, I think we're just better at hiding them, and we're better at now creating outlets for them that don't harm anyone else. Simulations like video games, for example, allow us to do some pretty dark stuff. There are tons of games out there, and if you think about the most popular games, all of them revolve around some form of action, some form of violence, some form of vice, some form of the shadow.
It was horrible.
Of course it was horrible. Violence is a very horrible thing.
Now, of course, a more simple mind would look at this and just say, oh, it's just because it's fun. But the reason why it's fun is because it taps into our darker desires, our animalistic nature, and the shadow. Hitman, a game all about assassination, all about, just going out there and mowing down as many people as possible, or your target. Again, it's up to you. If you want to play that way, you can literally go into, stadiums or, giant towns, or big buildings and literally, just wipe out absolutely everyone, okay? But it's not really that dark because it's a video game and none of these people are real. These are all NPCs. But there's a desire hidden within that, a dark desire within all of us, our morbid curiosity, you could say. But this comes from the shadow. And when you think about that, it actually becomes a little bit more scary when you are engaging in violence and vices in video games. So there are many ways video games tap into the shadow, the Jungian shadow, and play with those ideas. It can be through, thematic depth, like the story, the characters that you interact with. Fallout does this very well, with each faction representing a different ideology, a different belief system that you can interact with and decide if you believe in that system or you want to destroy that system, okay? RPGs like Vampire, whatever you want to call it, do this so well, in my opinion, where you can literally choose to kill and suck the living life essence out of every single NPC, and these NPCs feel quite alive. They have their own hopes, their own wishes, their own secrets. Games like this highlight the shadow very well, if you ask me. And as players, it's interesting that a lot of us don't even reflect on this. I personally reflect on this a lot. Sometimes I like to play a game exactly how I would in that situation, not just as role-playing as a persona, which again is another Jungian archetype, an aspect, like when you do an RPG game and you're playing as a character, but just playing as myself. What would I actually do in that situation? That way you can actually find out some pretty dark stuff about yourself. And I think that we all have dark thoughts. I know I personally do. I've thought of doing some dark stuff that I won't mention, but the point is I never act on these darker thoughts because I understand, the implications of these thoughts, and I try and live a life through morality, not through fear of what would happen if I actually did these actions. But video games allow for a safe environment for you to interact with these darker aspects. Now, the reason I find this topic so fascinating, and the reason I've wanted to talk about this for so long, is because there's always been, this kind of just quiet. There's always been this disconnect in society when it comes to media and what that media depicts. Now, I personally don't believe that violent video games make you violent. Like I said, I think they're a good outlet, actually. Same way as watching a war movie doesn't make you necessarily want to join the war, but it might influence you in some way. So I'm not here saying that we need to ban video games or ban violent media. I'm saying that it's interesting how society depicts some things as okay. For example, some games would allow you to cause violence to, younger NPCs, while other games would not allow you to do that. We have rating systems in place for what is okay and what is not okay. And I just find it so interesting that society depicts that integrating the shadow when it comes to do with media is somehow, fine, but some actions are completely off limits. And I mostly think that is because society in general, the average person, is afraid to take a deeper look at themselves and find that they have the potential for very disturbing, things. Just like, some of the worst atrocities to happen in, our own history. At the end of the day, people who did these things, they were all just people at the end of the day. The reason I wanted to talk about this is just simply because we know that all religions, all different philosophies and ideologies have a way of explaining the shadow, repenting for your sins, what constitutes as a sin. But some might say that simply thinking these things is already a sin, is already against, your moral being and your ethics, simply because they are already manifested within, the metaphysical realm, but not in the objective reality, something that you think but you don't actually do. Perhaps simply thinking these darker thoughts that we all wrestle with actually makes you a bad person, even if you never act on them. It's all about how well you know yourself and you integrate your shadow. But I just think the idea of games in particular, when you look at the essence of all video games, all of them, pretty much all of them to a point, are around some form of violence, some form of vice, some form of the shadow, okay? And that's because, we are all curious about these darker aspects. Most of us are just simply afraid to recognize that and to do anything about them. It's just interesting to see what will happen in the future, because as of right now, we are simulating our dark desires, and we call it entertainment. And that is because, gameplay-wise, it is fun. I'm not going to deny it's not fun. And like I said, it taps into something, deep within us that we all have. But what happens in the future when perhaps technology gets more and more developed? Perhaps, we are all interacting through virtual devices, and we're not harming other NPCs anymore, but we're harming other human beings in a simulated, safe environment, but it's still some form of real consciousness. That's when morality gets very, fucked up. So bringing back the Jungian Shadow and how it interacts with video games and the shadow, video games and the Jungian Shadow combined, what games actually do this well, okay? Well, when you play a game like GTA or something like Battlefield or a simple, multiplayer shooter, this doesn't really connect with you at all, because you are playing this game mostly for a different reason. Perhaps it's a competitive angle, perhaps, it's a social angle with your friends. So the things that you're actually doing in the game, like shooting enemy soldiers, doesn't really resonate or doesn't really have any impact on you. So when it comes to the art form of video games, it has to delicately, combine all of these elements together. And that's why RPGs do this the best. That's why games with, strong writing, strong characters, do this best. Because, yes, it's still just a game. Yes, these are just NPCs. But it makes you reflect on your choices. It makes you reflect on what you're doing in these game worlds. A lot of games, like GTA, for example, the NPCs, they don't matter, okay? They are just, ones and zeros. They are just, there to fill out the world. So it doesn't really matter what you do. You don't feel the weight of what you're doing. And of course, because it's a game. But my point is, I know it's just a game. I'm not crazy or something. But the point is, when it makes you reflect, when the game is done so well, when it has these features of thematic depth, good gameplay, good storytelling, writing, and some kind of gameplay mechanic that allows you to choose or allows you to reflect. These are games that, are very transformative, and that is the power of the Jungian Shadow in video games, and why I think it's the best media to reflect on, these aspects of ourselves, the darker psychology that we all have, and some philosophical elements that most media doesn't touch. Games like Spec Ops: The Line. I don't know if any of you have ever played this game, but it looks like a traditional third-person shooter, but actually it's a reflection on the horrors of war and the losing of sanity and the losing of yourself and purely becoming the shadow. So there are games out there that tackle this, and I just think we, don't really give them enough praise. And video games have the potential to really truly make ourselves more analytical and more self-aware. And that's just what I wanted to highlight today. Please let me know your thoughts down below on this discussion. It's something I truly feel passionate about. I do hope you enjoyed this video, and if you do, please share it around, give it a like. I'm so passionate about this type of topic. So thank you so much for watching, my wise ones, and I'll be seeing you in the next video. Peace out.